Alright guys, we'll continue our lecture on the political history of the UK, talking now about unification, war, and empire. So this is moving into the more modern portion of UK political history. So let's go ahead and start with the English Civil War. Now in AP World I certainly didn't talk a whole lot about this because it's way too complicated and also, frankly, not all that relevant if you're not English. However, now we're talking about the UK's political system, and the English Civil War matters a lot. So, if you remember, you have the Act of Supremacy established under Henry VIII, which establishes the King of England or the Queen of England as the head of the Anglican Church. Now, there's a little bit of waffling on this under Mary I, and then back to Elizabeth, because Mary I is Catholic. But under Elizabeth, the Protestantism thing kind of sticks. Big problem with Elizabeth, however, is that after her death, there is no immediate heir to the throne. So what happens is the Parliament decides to go up the family tree, figure out who should inherit the throne next, and they jump over to Scotland. There are members of the royal family who married into the royal family of Scotland several generations back, and now they're going to borrow them. So now we will pool the King of Scotland, James of Scotland, and make him James I of England. So James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England. James is a deeply unpopular king for a number of reasons. First and foremost, while he is technically Protestant and the head of the Anglican Church, he's not terribly, super Protestant. He's kind of like Diet Catholic. The thing that makes him Protestant is that he doesn't recognize the authority of the Pope. But that kind of fits because James doesn't really recognize the authority of basically anyone. He has much less respect for the role of Parliament than, say, even Henry VIII did, and definitely less respect than Elizabeth I did. He's not particularly diplomatic. He overspends like you would not believe, or maybe you would. And this gets him to a lot of hot water with Parliament. So he tried multiple times to raise taxes without Parliament's consent. Parliament got very annoyed by this. His son, Charles I, inherited these sort of pseudo-absolutist views about the role of a king, and likewise tries to raise taxes multiple times without consent of Parliament. In fact, for a period of time, Charles just doesn't call Parliament for nearly a decade. He only does call Parliament when he needs to go to war. In particular, he wants to go to war with Ireland. And this gets him into a lot of trouble. Ultimately, the distance between Parliament and the king has become almost unbridgeable. Parliament, which is primarily influenced by Puritans, if you remember, Puritans are coming out of a Calvinist doctrine of Protestantism. Puritans primarily kind of have this notion that if you are enjoying yourself, you are probably committing a sin. And Charles, on the other hand, enjoys a good party. So Charles is at odds with Parliament in part because of his cultural practice and religious practice, but also because of his disdain for economic policies that Parliament is trying to set forward. Parliament ultimately get so fed up with him that they rise up against him. They hire an army. There's a parliamentary military that rises against the king. This is the English Civil War, and it lasts for about 9-ish years. Charles I is ultimately captured by the parliamentary forces, and he is put to death. He is beheaded. This is before the French Revolution, so the French may think they're all that for killing a king, but the English did it first. So Charles is executed. This is a bit of a problem for the English throne, but we're just going to not have one for a while. So what occurs is that there is an interregnum where you have the leader of the parliamentary military, Oliver Cromwell, establishes himself as what is known as the Lord Protector of England. This is essentially a military dictatorship. It's not a kingship, although the position is hereditary. Cromwell is rather unpopular, even with other Puritans. He outlaws Christmas and dancing and theater and sports and makeup and all sorts of things. Basically, if it's fun, it is now illegal. So when Cromwell dies and his son inherits the role of Lord Protector of England, that falls by the wayside very, very quickly. And Parliament invites back in the king. The king now is, since Charles I is dead, his son, Charles II, is restored to the throne. Charles II has basically been waiting out this whole time, partying in France. Charles II is a very popular king. He's a nice dude. He's not particularly fiscally responsible, but he's predictable. People know what to kind of expect with him. Unfortunately, when Charles dies, he has lots of children, but none of them are legitimate. All of them are naturally dead, meaning that they can't inherit the throne. So his brother James is meant to inherit the throne next. However, James has some interesting religious practices. The requirement to be monarch in England is that one be the head of the Church of England. You can't be Catholic and be king of England. However, James definitely has some affection for Catholics. His first wife was Protestant, but his second wife is Catholic. And at the time of his ascension to the throne, his second wife was pregnant, and the concern was that if the child was a boy, and if the boy was baptized, he might be a Catholic, and that would throw the line of succession into disarray. So what Parliament does is Parliament decides to essentially continue that insurrection against the king, and they will establish a Bill of Rights, basically saying that the choice of political succession and the choice of political policy is essentially something that belongs to Parliament, not the king. And so what they'll do is they will invite in James's Protestant daughter and her husband, William, who is also a distant relative of the English royal family, and they will become the new king and queen of England. James, too, will be asked to politely leave the country, which he does because, frankly, he didn't want to be king that much anyway. So what we see here is Parliament essentially establishing its supremacy over the monarchy. The monarchy has less and less real legislative power here. The Parliament, not God, not the military, chooses who gets to be king, not the other way around, and that's kind of important now. This is William and Mary. If you notice that they look similar, that's because they're cousins. All right. So what we have with the establishment of the Bill of Rights in the 1680s is essentially the modern British political state. So in comparison with basically every European monarchy other than England, what we have is a monarchy that is developing that limits the power of the king or queen from a very early period. Now, France will eventually limit the power of its monarchy as well, but not until after they have an incredibly, incredibly bloody and divisive civil war. And think about what happens in Germany. Germany isn't even a real nation state until 1871. The Habsburg Empire exists all the way up until World War I. So, like, England gets this done pretty early. Now, what happens is after William and Mary become co-monarchs, they die without a surviving heir to the throne. Their children die in infancy. This means that Mary's sister Anne takes the throne. Anne has 17 pregnancies and no living children, which is deeply sad. One must imagine that it would have been very difficult for her. But this was a real problem for Parliament because they had kind of invited in this wing of the family and then there were no children. So Parliament deliberates as to what to do. They go back to the Bill of Rights, establish the idea that they have the right to choose the monarch, not the other way around, and they determine that they will use the Hanover, the German wing of the English royal family. Now, royals married into lots of other co-royal families all throughout Europe. There was one very solidly established royal family that was over in a relatively powerless German principality. Those were the Hanovers. So the Hanovers become the new heads of the English state, and they're brought over in 1714. Now, being German princes, now related to the English, but German primarily, King George I, the first of the Hanover kings, spoke almost no English for the entirety of his reign. This was actually something that Parliament liked. They liked this because it meant they had to rely on the cabinet and the prime minister to get anything done. The king really couldn't rule independently. He needed the legislative branch, and that was something that Parliament approved of. So they were totally okay with bringing in this foreign group that didn't really speak or understand English traditions. And essentially what it does is it establishes the modern role of the prime minister under Sir Robert Walpole. Now, Sir Robert Walpole was definitely a wealthy landowner, but he wasn't a noble, he wasn't a lord, he wasn't a duke. He was knighted for services to the realm, but it shows a degree of meritocracy that is developing in British history here, which is a big deal. Additionally, the power of Parliament and the power of the Prime Minister is further cemented under King George III. George III is the fellow who loses the American colonies. He also suffered from a disease called porphyria, which made him subject to periods of delusion and night terrors. He became functionally insane during his periods of the disease affecting his life. It was a very sad situation. But because of his loss of military supremacy and because of his unreliability in terms of his mental state, King George III was basically unable to rule during the latter half of his life. So his prime ministers and the cabinet were directly chosen by Parliament, not by the monarch. This is where we're starting to see the parliamentary system of democracy develop, where you have the Parliament is in charge of choosing the executive, not anyone else. So there's Robert Walpole. You can see here his awesome wig, and you can also see, if you look in this political cartoon, you can see kind of the narrative that's going on. So over here it says pulling for a crown, and it says the Tories and the Whigs. We've got two different political parties, and you've got the king, or rather, actually, that's the Prince of Wales, who was the regent for King George III once he lost his mind. You can tell that that's the Prince of Wales because it's got the 3 feathers, which is associated with the Prince of Wales. But you have two essentially political parties. One over here is backed by Robert Walpole, dun dun dun, trying to kind of pool the political system back and forth. So this is an early political cartoon, and what you see here is a 2-party system developing. Now, I'll get more into that in just a second. So, now, we're going to get into the 2-party system in a minute, but I want to catch you up to date on what is going on in Ireland at this point because it's relevant. So, the Irish question. Now, Ireland is a complicated issue when we consider what is going on in English political history, because if you remember, Ireland was never conquered by the Romans. It was essentially established by the Celts, and they did their own thing. So they basically are on their own until about the 1100s. In the 1100s, Norman feudal lords make their way across the Irish Sea and start settling in Ireland. Now, they're doing this as vassals of the English king. So you have these Norman feudal lords who decide that they want to conquer Ireland, so they move over there. Now, Ireland's not empty. There are Irish clans that are already established, and these feudal lords marry into this system. Ireland, however, therefore has ties to the English crown because usually the clan leaders are descendants and relatives of these Norman feudal lords who had married into these systems, but the crown doesn't directly rule. Local rulers, those clan leaders, continue to persist, and they basically are fully autonomous. Ireland even had its own parliament for a long time. So Ireland was used to self-rule. They had a very weak and weird connection to England. However, particularly as a result of the War of the Roses, which is far too complicated for me to get into, Ireland didn't really like the Tudors, and the Tudors were the ones who wound up winning the War of the Roses. That's Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward V, Mary I, Elizabeth I. All of those are the Tudors. And the reason why the Irish didn't really like the Tudors was because the Tudors were Protestant and the Irish are Catholics. So Henry doesn't like the fact that he has this unreliable group of people right across the Irish Sea, so he decides to invade into Ireland. Now I'm going to stop this recording here and move on in just a moment. So please move on to the next video.